Well, hello and welcome. My name is Luke Walton. I'm a film producer, but it's my privilege to welcome you to the world's oldest church, Seven Songs from Isseos, which brings together two inspirational people, a good friend of mine, poet and artist Roger Wagner, and a distinguished professor and historian and author, Michael Peppard, who is joining us from the States. And there are two books involved in this. And Roger, I think you have those books. Here are the books.
I have
One
them here.
called Nearer You Stand, and the other, The World's Oldest Church.
You probably won't see them unless I say something, which point they may pop up. So here we are.
There we go. So thank you. And I am really excited because I found it so inspirational to first learn about Dura Europos. So if you haven't yet heard about that, you're in for a complete treat. And I want to begin by asking Roger about his very first trip to Dura Europos, because I've not had the opportunity to go, but I remember you telling me about this visit, and I've been fascinated by it ever since. Tell us about your first visit to Dura Europos.
So it was back in 1998. No, 1996. It was before that. And I was traveling in a bus along. There's a road that sort of goes along the Euphrates through all these Bedouin villages, which I just really wanted to get out and paint every moment. It's the most extraordinary and very, very friendly people who, when we passed by, everyone would wave at the delightful kind of place, but very. We went past a place called Mari, it's one of the oldest cities, and then we came to this huge site, and it was the extraordinary thing in Syria in those days that you'd turn up in somewhere like this, and you went through a huge gate. It was a vast Roman city, but you were the only people there. There was a guide who on a sort of motorbike who would sort of take you around, but otherwise you were just completely alone. And we walked. I remember walking down to there's a great synagogue, and then we went around to the where the Roman governor's palace was, the Dux Ripae he was called, and which has this extraordinary view out over the Euphrates. And I did a painting there, but then I'd heard somewhere that there was a very early Christian church, and I asked the guide about this, and they said no. But we found it, and it was completely unimpressive. There was just some walls and plastic bags that had blown in from the desert, but it was, as title of Michael's book, The World's Oldest Church. So it was an extraordinary. I knew very little about it at that point, but it just remained with me as somewhere that I wanted to know about, and it was just clearly a very important place.
That's an extraordinary description of your finding it. But Michael, give us something of a feel of what Dura was like during the Roman period, and how did this house church come to be discovered?
Sure. Thanks for having me, and thanks for this invitation. The discovery of the house church I'll get to in a second, but let me try to paint a picture of the place before that. So it's a mouthful, even the title of this place, Dura-Europos, right? The book publisher hated that wanted to be on the cover because nobody knows what to do with that. But Dura comes from a Semitic word meaning fortress or stronghold, and Europos was a name that was given to a settlement by the successors of Alexander the Great, who wanted to honor his Macedonian heritage and birthplace. So what do we have here? We have a place that's been often called a crossroads of antiquity, and there's an edited volume titled Crossroads of Antiquity about Dura, which is filled with great essays that I recommend. And the more you look into the evidence, the material record of the place, the deeper you look into it, the more you're convinced that this is true. The diversity of languages in this very, very small Eastern military outpost, the diversity of ethnicities that we find in the record from graffiti and papyrology and artwork, the diversity of cultic or religious buildings that we find in this place is quite something. So this led one of the excavators, Michael Rostovstev, a Russian emigre who then became a Yale University classicist, led Rostovstev to call it the Pompeii of the Syrian desert. And he was trying to ennoble it through that title and say that this was going to be, of course, as big as Pompeii and his big project, right? He was a bit self-grandizing in that, I think. But partially it's true. There is a sense that we learned more about kind of a micro history of regular life in one place through the Dura excavations than we have about almost anywhere else in the Near East. So again, to give a sense of place, it's a fairly small footprint. By modern standards, a very, very small town. I think less than 1,000 meters along the city wall's edge. So very compact, dense. A few thousand people. We're not sure exactly, but a few thousand, maybe 3,000 to 5,000, something like that. So what we would consider a small town. But at its height, after the Romans had occupied it during the Roman era, it was perhaps 25% or more military. So it's also a military town, and that shapes its culture, its imagination, its artwork, everything that we discover there. Even the very building that Roger has discussed, where we have a term Dux Ripae that we only have evidence for in this one place. We don't have it anywhere else. A kind of commander of the riverbank, someone who is guarding this eastern edge of the Roman Empire on the border with the Persians. So the Euphrates has been a border and a conduit, right? Rivers are both things. Usually they're both borders and passageways. It's been that for as long as we have human record. And during this Roman and Persian era, it was usually considered a border or the border between these two areas. So the fact that it was always kind of on the edge, an empire on the edge, or on the edge of empires, I should say, leads then to the modern discovery, where it was also discovered during a war. As listeners may know, at the end of World War I, there was a lot of uncertainty in the Middle East, a lot of uncertainty about borders, who is in charge of what land. And when you have uncertainty about borders, you have chaos. You have power vacuums, right? And so the British and French controlled various parts, but controlled is really not the right word. They had a presence, but they didn't really have control. And so there were British troops patrolling this area, what's modern day Syria, border of Syria and Iraq. But of course, those borders were drawn at this time, at the end of World War I. And they were pretty much bored, I think. I think they didn't have anything to do out where they were, and they were exploring around in these ruins. And long story short, they discovered what we now call the Temple of the Palmyrene Gods, or the Julius Terentius image, which is so-called because of a Latin name of the Roman military leader who is there making a sacrifice on an altar in this painting. And that was what started it all. So that first painting, and we still have it, that's up in the Yale Art Gallery. You can see it today, that these soldiers looked at and called ahead up the chain of command and said, hey, someone should come out here. And they said, if that American archaeologist is still around, you should send him over. That American archaeologist was James Henry Bredsted, who was founding the nascent Oriental Institute of Chicago at the University of Chicago. And he was in modern day, what we call Iraq. And he made an overland journey over the desert very dangerously through a war zone, and came to see this site, and was there only one day and decided it was as significant as the soldiers had thought. And so then this started a process, which you can read my book and read more about, which I also want to say, the book is open access. So I'm not here to sell books. Through a grant with Yale University Press, I was able to make the book open access for freely downloadable for anyone, because I wanted people in the Middle East who did not have means for a $50 book to be able to read it, especially Syrian heritage readers. So the book is free for anyone if you want to read it. And what you'll find there is that this excavation went from Bredsted, who didn't really excavate but just looked, and then we have the Belgians involved, and then we have a team from France and the United States that really take the heart of it. And then there are Armenian workers as well who come in as foremen who are very, very important in the discoveries. And this all leads up to a day in 1932 when they're digging away at excavation block M8, and all of a sudden they see some paintings on a wall, and the first recorded image in recorded words in Clark Hopkins' journal of that from that day, which I read in the field notes at Yale's collection, is that he saw a god on a cloud. A god on a cloud. And turns out after more and more work, this is not a god on a cloud, but this is what we now recognize as the healing of Jesus' healing of the paralytic, where Jesus is standing somewhat above in the field of vision, the paralytic who is below. And it's not a cloud, it's really just kind of a drawing of ground. But he was right about one thing, that it was a religious building when he identified that. So that was really what set it off. And then a couple seasons of excavation, and in the partage, and I'll conclude here, in the partage, the dividing up of the finds at the end of each season, there was a Yale team, a French team, and a local team from Beirut, and they divided things up that season. And the Americans really wanted the Dura synagogue, actually, the Jewish building. They thought that was the most significant for historians, and certainly there's a large Jewish presence in American Northeast, so they wanted that. But the story goes, this is not in my book, but that they I don't think, but that they tipped their hand too much, and they kind of showed how much they wanted it. And the local team figured that out, that maybe this was more important than they realized, and so the synagogue is in Damascus.
So it could have been it'd have been a good double bluff if they'd been playing their hand right? But
that's right. It was not sadly, it was not a double bluff, but so the synagogue is in Damascus, is still intact. Thankfully, they didn't leave it at Dura or it'd be gone, but it's in Damascus, in the Damascus Museum. The Christian materials and many other materials came to the United States, to Yale, and then a lot of materials also went to Paris. So there's a division of those seasons of those items. I could obviously go on, so I should.
No, I've let you. It's wonderful to hear, because it's such an exciting discovery and so significant. But I am going to go back to Roger, because Roger, you have the first of your poems, don't you? Which kind of bounces off some of what Michael set out for us, which is so exciting. And I wonder if you would just introduce it and perhaps read it for us.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the title of the whole thing is called Seven Songs for Isseos, and Isseos is a character who is a real person who we know is a member of the congregation of that church, and he was a convert, so we know that about him. So in the poem, I imagine him as, I mean, Michael said it was a garrison town. I imagine him as a soldier, and I imagine him walking on the walls where I did the painting, which is quite possible. And I imagine at some point he must have become a Christian, and so I imagine that moment, and looking out where the two empires, the Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire, sort of meet across the river, and so that's that was the basis of the poem. Just kind of imagining what that moment might have been like. So, shall I read the poem?
Please do.
7 Songs for Isseos. Number 1. The miradores of the world are balconies from which we view the long horizons of our lives transforming to transparent blue. The many lands become as one. 1,000 views become one whole. The absolutes of distance touch some absolute within the soul. And while the palace on the heights has settled far down into time, its high perspective still incites the eye to follow as it shows the river's slowly winding flows towards and endless, blue, sublime.
The faint sounds of a flock of sheep ride on the winds from far below, up to the heights where Isseos scents the cooking smoke and sees it blow from hearths throughout the army town. A sentry on the northern wall from where the Dux Ripae looks down, he hears the signal trumpet call and marches out towards the tower where Proclus stands to take the roll. But as the trumpet marks the hour, a moment in that evening heat ignites as when two empires meet, some absolute within his soul. The river flows through desert lands and leaves in passing fields of green where crops grow through the arid sands and wilderness is thick with wheat.
The river flows where empires meet and all allegiance is aligned, where thoughts resolve and choice is made between opposing states of mind. So Isseos, standing on that height, as in a moment out of time, finds in that evening's fading light some absolute within his soul which draws him like his own heart's goal towards an endless blue sublime.